All right, good morning, ladies and gents. We are going to be going into our second lab, which is country biscuits with a optional chocolate gravy. Now, a lot of you have made biscuits before or have had biscuits and gravy before. This is going to be a slightly sweeter version of that. The biscuits themselves are the main lab for today. The chocolate gravy is kind of optional, but it's a cool skill to learn, not only teaching you how to make a bechamel sauce, but also to kind of change it up and make an alternative to it. So let's go ahead and get started. So let me give you the ingredient measurements first. So I'm just as the last lab that we did, I'm going to give you the weight measurements as well as the volumetric measurements. Okay. So just for the biscuits, you're going to need 4.7 ounces of flour, or 1 heaping cup of flour. So what I mean by a heaping cup is normally like when you measure out flour, you have the scoop and then you kind of level it off. Well, a heaping scoop is when you fill it kind of almost all the way. Okay, so that would be a heaping cup. So you're not going to scrape off, you're just going to heap it that way. Okay. So, but the weight measurement is 4.7 ounces. You're going to need 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 1/4 of a teaspoon of baking soda, 1/2 a teaspoon of kosher salt. Okay. 1/2 ounce or 1 tablespoon of unsalted butter. Now I have that in the fridge right now. That is going to stay cold just until I mix it in. Okay, so we've talked about before with the Biscuit Method needing cold, chilled fats. That's why it's in the fridge. Okay, so 1/2 ounce or 1 tablespoon of unsalted butter. I'm going to need 1/2 ounce or 1 tablespoon of shortening. Okay, if you got an ingredient kit, this little baggie or container that has this kind of white, softish kind of goo in there, this is the shortening. Okay, I did make a mistake. I forgot to write down shortening on all of them. So this is your shortening. Okay, and then finally, you're going to need 4 ounces or 1/2 a cup of buttermilk. Now, buttermilk, what is that? So buttermilk is a type of milk that has been slightly spoiled, actually. So you can see on the label here, cultured low-fat buttermilk. The cultured part is an actual bacteria that is in this milk that slightly curdles it. Now, all of you have probably had buttermilk biscuits or buttermilk pancakes or something like that. This is where it comes from. Now, this milk is completely safe to drink and to work with. It's basically spoiled by good bacteria that's actually really good for you, that slightly adds a bit of acid to the milk, but also thickens it up and gives it kind of a nice, acidic tang to it. Now, as you can see on mine, you can see that it's past the expiration date. What's funny is that this expiration date actually doesn't mean a whole lot, because with buttermilk, since it's already technically spoiled, which is what buttermilk should be, this expiration date really is only put there just because the government requires it. As far as if this is still usable, yeah, it's still perfectly safe to use, to drink, to cook with and bake with. So this is what we're going to be using today. Now, a lot of you will not have buttermilk in your home. So what you're able to do is you're able to take 1/2 a cup or 4 ounces of regular milk and make a substitute by doing 4 ounces or 1/2 a cup of milk and mixing in 1/2 a tablespoon of white vinegar. Okay, a lot of you have gotten in your kits the little container that says vinegar. That's what that vinegar is for. It's basically making a buttermilk substitute. So you're just taking a little bit of milk and then adding the acid in the vinegar to kind of substitute or mimic what buttermilk is. Okay, so this is slightly acidic, which will activate the baking soda in our recipe. Here, you're going to add a little bit of vinegar into regular milk to simulate what buttermilk does in the recipe. Okay, so either way there, whether you have buttermilk or regular milk, just spiked with a little bit of vinegar, that's good. Okay, so those are the ingredients as far as the biscuits are concerned. Now, if you want to make the chocolate gravy, which I definitely would recommend doing, okay, the ingredients for that, so on your mise en place sheet, you'll probably want to list these ingredients separately from, like make a little bit of a space on your mise en place sheet and then do these ingredients separately. You're going to need 1/2 ounce or 1 tablespoon of unsalted butter, 1.2 ounces of sugar or 2 heaping tablespoons of sugar, 1 tablespoon or 0.2 ounces of flour, or sorry, 0.1 ounces of flour. So 1 tablespoon or 0.1 ounces of flour, 2 tablespoons or 0.4 ounces of cocoa powder. Now with your ingredient kits, that container that I gave you, the of cocoa, that is your 2 tablespoons. So that cocoa is not needed for any other recipe, so you can just add that right in. Okay, and then finally 4 ounces or 1/2 cup of whole milk, and a small pinch of kosher salt. Okay, so again, those are 2 separate recipes. Okay, the biscuits are the main recipe here. The chocolate gravy is kind of one of those things that it's optional, but it really is, you know, a really cool skill to have, and also it's a delicious sauce that goes along with it. Okay, all right. So let's go ahead, let's get started. So step number 1 for the biscuits is you're going to preheat your oven to 450 degrees. So, okay, 450 degrees. Now, before we go any further, the equipment that I'm going to need is I'm going to need a baking sheet with parchment paper. If you do not have a baking sheet, you can use a cake tin for this. That's completely okay too. You're going to need your mixing bowls, digital scale if you have it, measuring spoons and measuring cups, whisk, a spatula. Now, I would highly recommend having some sort of scraper, some sort of table or bench scraper to use when you're making this. Now, if you don't have one of these, you can use an old credit card or some sort of card that's in your wallet. That's completely okay, or the edge of a spatula. Some sort of cookie cutter or the lid of a container to use kind of as a cutter for you. Now, you don't have to make round biscuits here. You can just cut it in using a knife, just cut it into like square biscuits. That's completely okay too. And then a pot for if you're going to be making the sauce to go with it. Okay, so let's get started. So, step number 2, you're going to combine in a bowl your flour, baking powder, baking soda, and salt. So, one bowl, I'm going to combine basically my dry ingredients. So I'm going by weight. Let me actually just turn the scale around here. I'm not sure if you guys will be able to see the numbers. Okay, so 4.7 ounces. Half a teaspoon of kosher salt. 2 teaspoons of baking powder. Now remember, the baking powder only needs an acid in order to activate, hence why we're able to put a lot more of it. It's not quite as strong as baking soda, but so that's why we need to just add a little bit more of it. Okay, and then finally, 1/4 of a teaspoon of baking soda. And I'm just gonna combine that together. Okay, now I'm going to go to step 2. I've taken my butter out of the fridge, and I'm going to go to the next step here, which is I'm going to cut in the fat, so the butter and the shortening. Okay, so I'm going to cut off 1 tablespoon or 1/2 ounce of the butter. And then using my scale, add in 1/2 ounce of shortening. So close. All right, there we go. Okay, a little extra, that's fine. Okay, so now what do I mean by cutting in? Well, now we have to basically break up this fat into very, very fine pieces. Now there's a couple ways you can do it. You can use a specialty pastry blender and basically cut it that way. You can take 2 knives and literally just kind of keep running your knives in opposite directions, cutting the fat into the flour. Or my personal recommendation, just use your fingers. So coat the fat in the flour, and then using just your fingertips, because you want this fat to stay cold, just kind of break up the butter into very fine pieces and continue to kind of mix that in. If you find like a big piece of fat or shortening or butter, just kind of take it and just kind of squeeze it with your fingertips to kind of break it up. Okay. Now, as I'm doing this, the whole purpose of this is to basically coat the fat in flour. So that way, not only does the fat, do we have a bunch of small little pieces of butter inside the dough as it bakes, giving it tenderness and also flakiness, but it also keeps gluten from developing in our dough, so that when you bake this and when it's done, it's nice and tender. So again, just kind of going through, just kind of squeezing the bits. So you can kind of see my flour right now, there's still a few big pieces of fat in there. So I'm just going to continue to kind of just work that in until basically all the pieces are about the size of a pea. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to come around to the camera here and I'll show you guys what this should look like. So if you can see here, the fat is still in like small pieces, but it's no bigger than, say, the size of a pea. Okay, so this looks a little crumbly. That is perfect, and we're good to go to our next step. Okay, so next step, this should be step 4. I'm going to make a well in the center of my bowl, and I'm going to add in the chilled buttermilk. So that's the buttermilk for me. If you are using milk spiked with vinegar, that's what you are using right now. Okay, so I'm gonna turn on my scale. Give this a little shake. And I'm gonna pour in. Okay, I'm just gonna undershoot it slightly as far as how much milk I need, and that's a good idea for you too. Is when you're measuring half of a cup of buttermilk, you should kind of hold back a little bit of it just in case it doesn't need it, because it's easier to kind of add in some more liquid. It's a little harder to take it out. Okay, so what I'm going to do, so this is step 4, you're gonna make a well and you're going to mix it together just until the dough comes together. Okay, so I'm going to just kind of stir this together just until I don't see any more dry flour. Okay, now this dough is going to be very, very sticky. Okay, and we want that. Okay, so just when I see no more dry flour, I'm gonna stop mixing. Just walk away. All right. So now we go into, I believe, step 5. I'm going to dust the counter generously with flour. And I'm just gonna knead the dough together until, like, for 5 or 6 times, just until it forms up into a solid, smooth mass. So putting my dough down, dust, don't go crazy here, but dust it on top. And from here, this is kind of now where you kind of develop your feel here. Okay, the dough should not be super sticky, but it should have a little bit of tackiness to it. Okay, so if you're kneading this together and it's really starting to stick to your hands, add in and sprinkle a little bit of flour. However, if it feels like it's not sticking to you all and the only thing you're feeling is dry flour, then just knead it together. Do not add any more dry flour. If there's too much of it, just move your dough to the side away from all the flour and just continue to work it there. Okay, so from here, I'm gonna just pat the dough out and I'm going to fold it over. And see right now how it's like very crumbly and it's kind of not staying together? Well, that's gonna change. So I'm going to fold it, knead it, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6. Now notice how the dough is sticking together now. Okay, that's because by kneading it slightly, we've developed a little bit of gluten, but I'm not going to keep kneading until we've developed too much of it. Okay, so here, this is good to go. It's going to be tender, it's staying together, so there's enough gluten to keep it held together, but there's not so much that it's going to be like a hockey puck when we've cooked this. Okay, so I'm then going to go to step 6, which is I'm just going to press out the dough until it's about 1 inch in thickness. So again, these are biscuits. You don't have to, it's not like, we're making these for the Queen of England or for a fancy restaurant. Okay, they don't have to be perfect, okay? And then I'm going to cut them into my rounds, or if you don't have a cookie cutter or the lid of a can or anything like that, you can just take a knife and then you can just cut it into squares and then have them that way. Yeah, they won't look as pretty, but who cares? Okay. For me, just going to dust the cutter. I'm going to place it on top and I'm going to press down, and then only when the cutter hits the board am I going to twist it slightly. So again, put it down, twist, and there we go. So I then have 2 perfectly formed biscuits. So I'm going to put them on my baking sheet just so they touch just slightly. Okay, so this is my next step here, is I'm going to place the biscuits onto a sheet pan just so they're slightly touching. So with the extra dough, what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to form that back together, and I'm just going to knead it together like 2 times. Okay, so I don't want to knead this too much, again, because every time I'm kneading here, it is developing a little more gluten. So these biscuits will be a little tougher than the ones over there, but you don't want to waste dough. So again, press down, twist, okay? And then you have a little less pretty biscuit, but it's still good. Okay. Now, as far as these scrap pieces, you can always just kind of roughly form them back together. Again, yes, it's not as pretty, but these are biscuits. You know, they don't need to be all beautiful for Gordon Ramsay. So it's good enough. Okay. So I have my biscuits and they are ready to bake. Okay. All right. So for my last step for the biscuits, I'm going to bake these in a 450-degree oven until they're light and golden, about 15 to 20 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to set my timer for 15 minutes, check on them, and then once they're ready to go, I'll take them out. So did you guys enjoy that light show from the camera spazzing out? Was that enjoyable? Yeah, sorry about that, guys. I'll make sure to put a video or a link just kind of showing that one step where the camera was kind of freaking out there. Sometimes it has trouble adjusting to the any sort of white inside the image. It sometimes has trouble adjusting. So, all right. Now, as the biscuits are baking, I'm going to go ahead and make the sauce. So, now this is the completely different recipe now. So, what I'm going to do is now step 1 for the sauce is I'm going to be making a bechamel. So step 1 is I'm going to heat and melt the butter into a saucepan. Once the butter is melted, I'm going to go to the second step, which is I'm going to mix in my sugar, my flour, and the cocoa powder. So, it's my 1 tablespoon of butter. Going to add in my flour. My sugar. And cocoa powder. And I'm just going to mix this together until you see it kind of all clumps up together. And just cook slightly. Now you can see this kind of almost looks like burnt. It's like kind of crumbly. If you've ever made a mac and cheese and made a bechamel, that's kind of what this is. So I'm going to go to my third step here, is I'm going to very slowly add in my milk. So add a little bit, whisk it in, add a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to turn off my heat just for right now. Add in a little more. Turn the heat back on. Okay. I'm just going to add a little bit at a time just to avoid lumps. Okay, and then I have all my milk in. Okay. So that was step 3 for this sauce. Now, one thing I forgot to add is a pinch of kosher salt. Remember, just because it's sweet or just because it's a dessert does not mean it shouldn't get any seasoning. Okay, my 4th step is just going to be just to simmer this until it is thickened. I'm just going to let it cook for just on a low simmer until the biscuits are done. So just going to whisk this together. Now, don't be like me and leave the whisk over a hot flame so it can get nice and hot. Be a little smarter than me. Just make sure you're whisking around the edges of the pan. So you can see, because I added the milk in slowly, you see the sauce is going to be nice and smooth, no lumps. I'm just basically waiting for this to come up to a boil so that it will start to thicken. Okay, once you see it start to kind of bubble and boil like that, you can turn down your heat just to a very low simmer and just let it continue to boil and just let it simmer. Just make sure to stir it occasionally to keep it from burning. And then this will be ready to serve with the biscuits. All right? Alright, so I take them out, and look at that. Nice and golden brown, raised up. If I try to carefully show one to the camera, you can see nice and flaky. Okay, you guys see all these different layers. This is what the Biscuit Method provides here. Okay, now I'm going to let this cool just for a little bit. I'm going to take my gravy. Now, if it's a little thick or it's clumped up, I'll just thin it out with just a tad more milk, just a splash here and there. And once this is cool, I'm going to plate this up.